Channel Y. Channel Y. A South Asian Canadian channel.
Hi, this is Priyanka Chopra and you're watching Channel Y.
The biggest South Asian media group, Y Media. Y Media. Y Media has newspaper, midweek, radio, South Asian Pulse.
Hi, I'm Amitabh Bachchan and you're listening to South Asian Pulse.
Hi, this is Amir Khan and you're listening to South Asian Pulse.
Television. You are watching Channel Y. Channel Y.
Prime Minister, welcome.
It's a pleasure to be back.
Online, SouthAsianDaily.com. The biggest South Asian media group, Y Media.
Hello and welcome to a Y Media exclusive interview. I'm your host Ramona Singh, and in studio I have Garnett Genuis. He is a Conservative MP from the riding of Sherwood, Parkford, Saskatchewan in Alberta, and he's also the Shadow Minister for International Development, and he's joining us today to talk about his private member's bill. Welcome. How are you today?
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you and your viewers today.
Absolutely. It's been quite some time since I saw you.
Yeah.
The last time I saw you, I think, was during 2019 election time, and I remember you were just about to have another baby. So tell us about your growing family.
Sure. Well, we had 3 at the time, and then we had our 4th right before the 2019 election, and we've had a 5th since. So we've got a 3-month-old. And it always seems that our family expansions are timed to align with major political events. You know, it's like if one big thing's happening, other big things are happening. So it was the day of this time it was the day of the vote on the Federal Emergencies Act. So we have this weekend-long debate happening on the Emergencies Act and all the big, historic issues that were raised by that. So my wife had the baby. I was there, of course, but I was voting about an hour later and going live to talk about the Emergencies Act issues. So yeah, there's a lot of competing things going on, but it's wonderful to be part of a big family and have all that support.
So you have a lot of practice in managing stress. It seems like having all those massive things happen at the same time. Yeah,
and dealing with hecklers, right? You know, I'm giving a speech online or doing an interview, and then I got kids coming in and out. So yeah, it's good. It's great. I wouldn't trade my life for anything, but it's pretty busy.
With 5 kids, what are the ages?
So my oldest is 9, and then so 9, 6, 4, 2, and 3 months.
Wow, that's very nice to have such a growing family, and I think the sky's the limits for you guys, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's fun too, just being in politics as my daughter in particular, the oldest. Like, the older she gets, the more kind of engaged she is with it, and I think she'd be great in politics. She's got lots of interests, of course, and she's still quite young, but she asks so many good questions, and so as they get older, it's a different kind of experience, and I just love kind of bringing them into my life and showing them the things that I do.
That's amazing. I think you're gonna probably one day beat Andrew Scheer's record of 6 kids, right?
He's got 5, so
wait,
we're,
sorry. So you guys are even. I don't know why I thought it was 6.
Now.
Okay, so you're even now. So
it's funny. There are a few members in the Conservative Party. I think we have 4 MPs that have 5 kids, but. So it's kind of we got a pool going. Who's going to be the first one to 6?
The first one to 6. That's good to hear. And now that you brought up the birth of your child was at the same time as the Emergencies Act that was invoked. That is very significant with a committee happening right now for the hearing of what was the decision that cabinet ministers made during that time frame. And Marco Mendicino, he's essentially gone back and forth on his response of who actually asked for the Emergencies Act to be invoked. And the Conservatives are now asking him to resign. So tell us a little bit about that. Yeah,
this is a very, very serious issue. This is the first time the Emergencies Act has ever been used in Canada. Its predecessor, the War Measures Act, was used in the previous world wars, and it was used by the last Prime Minister Trudeau during the FLQ crisis. So these are very extreme measures that involve the suspending of the application of laws that normally apply aimed at protecting civil liberties and human rights and so forth. So very significant. It should be used very sparingly. The government invoked the Emergencies Act in this case. We opposed that. We thought, look, there were There were some blockades that needed to be addressed, but fundamentally, this was an abuse of power by the government. And it's been clear in the subsequent analysis, the minister, Marco Mendicino, saying that they did so on the advice of law enforcement, and law enforcement basically saying that that's not the case. And then the follow-up saying, well, the minister was misunderstood in his original comments. And look, we don't think that ministers or politicians should be saying things that are untrue at the best of times, but this wasn't the best of times. This was a very serious situation. The use of a rare legislative instrument that constrains the normal application of human rights protections. So it was very disappointing that the government used this, what ultimately proved to be a false rationale, to bring this in. And I just think when a minister does that, there's a point of no return at which you've lost the confidence of your colleagues and of Canadians. And I think he should do the right thing. The Prime Minister should do the right thing. We should have a new Minister of Public Safety.
And just for our viewers, the Emergencies Act that was invoked earlier this year essentially gave permission to law enforcement as well as banks to freeze bank accounts. So over 200 bank accounts were frozen. We're talking about checking accounts, savings accounts, credit cards frozen. About almost $8 million was frozen in that time period until February 23rd. So very significant. It gave police the ability to make arrests, tow trucks, and everything that was happening without actually having to have any sort of evidence to do so, or having an arrest warrant or any of that. So you're right. It was Canadians' civil rights, their liberties taken away completely during the invocation of the Emergencies Act. So very, very important stuff. And today we want to talk about your private member's bill. Tell us a bit about that, and it has to do with Human Rights Act, and very similar to what we're talking about when it comes to invoking.
Yeah, so it's not mine, but I'm seconding the bill. So
Okay.
I'm very, very keen to talk about it. The sponsor of the bill is Philip Lawrence, another Conservative member of Parliament here in Ontario, and he's put forward this bill. I'm working with him to support it, and I know it's something that many of your viewers will be interested in. It's a kind of a broad international human rights bill with a number of different kinds of measures that seek to advance the protection of human rights and strengthen Canada's engagement with international human rights. So there's a few different provisions in it. One is to address investments made in something called cluster munitions. These are a kind of weapon that's very indiscriminate in its application to civilians, so to try to limit the use of cluster munitions. But I think what will be of most interest to people is some of the reporting requirements. So this is designed to force the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the government to be more responsive to Parliament when it comes to human rights. So the Minister of Foreign Affairs will have to table an annual report on international human rights. So the work the government is doing on international human rights, or says they're doing, they're going to have to now come to Parliament every year and table a report. And this will be a great tool for us to ask questions, to hold the government accountable, to say, hey, there's this situation happening, why didn't you raise that issue? That report will have to contain as well a list of prisoners of conscience that the government is advocating for. So people that are unjustly imprisoned, the Canadian government is working to secure their release. Disclosing their names, talking about their cases will bring more light and attention to their case. So these are some of the aspects in that report. And then creating a requirement that when a parliamentary committee recommends someone be sanctioned under the Magnitsky Sanctions Act, the government has to respond to that recommendation. So just a bit of background on Magnitsky sanctions, right? Magnitsky sanctions are a sanctions tool that are aimed at holding perpetrators of human rights violations to account. And if somebody is sanctioned under the Magnitsky Act, they aren't able to travel to Canada or move their money here. And when like-minded nations, Canada, the US, countries in Europe, come together and sanction an individual, add that person to their Magnitsky sanctions list, that person is much more likely to face consequences for their actions. If you're a senior official in a corrupt country, maybe you want to move your money out of the country, maybe you want to have an escape plan. If you're subject to Magnitsky sanctions because you've crossed a certain threshold in terms of violation of human rights, then you're not going to be able to do that. So it was a Conservative MP, James Bazan, that put forward the Magnitsky Act, providing the government with that tool. The bill passed in the 2 parliaments ago. But the government has been very reluctant to use it. So it gives the government a tool, but they haven't used that tool. They haven't really been sanctioning people who violate human rights. There are many cases where whole countries where we know there are big human rights problems, the government hasn't sanctioned a single individual. So we want to go a step further now and say Parliament should be able to put individuals forward to sanction. I should be able to go to the Foreign Affairs Committee and move a motion to say we should sanction someone who's a human rights abuser. It's ultimately up to the government to use the power of government to assess that and decide whether they're sanctioning that person. But this bill, the International Human Rights Act, it's Bill C-281, it would require that the government respond when that's put forward. It would require the government to respond to the committee. And this is an opportunity as well for people in different communities who are connected to a country of origin and are aware of human rights abuses. They can bring forward names to us of individuals that are involved in human rights abuses. We can use this committee process to put those names forward to the government, and the government has to investigate those cases and respond. So it's a very powerful tool for promoting accountability for human rights abuses.
Absolutely, and when it comes to Canada and the international stage, when it comes to what's happening in Ukraine with Russian forces and the war that's been going on since February 24th, it's been devastating over 3 months, and the lives that are lost, and the Ukrainians that have been misplaced, almost 7 million throughout the country of Ukraine, and almost 4 million refugees, with most of them in the bordering country of Poland. So it's very devastating, and in those cases, then opposition officials can actually put forth persons that they'd like to bring sanctions towards. That would be the case, and holding the government accountable, and in terms of in committee. That's what this private member's bill will do.
Absolutely, yeah. It's that tool of being able to bring forward those proposals and have that recommendation to the government, and then the government can respond. You mentioned the situation in Ukraine. The government has sanctioned individuals involved in the invasion of Ukraine, but we were pushing for those individuals actually to be sanctioned even prior to the invasion, because we saw this coming. We knew that the government of Russia was pre-positioning, and we were advocating sanction those individuals now to send a clear message of deterrence. Because if you don't have that clear deterrence in advance, then sometimes the situation escalates. And acting after the fact, it's better than not acting at all, but we could have acted earlier.
Right, because the Russian forces, the tanks, were at the border for quite some time before they crossed it, and it was the speculation was there that they were going to go to war any day. Yeah,
the broad problem we have internationally when it comes to human rights is a sense of impunity. When you have leaders, governments, in other countries, they're in control. They don't really think often that they will face consequences for their actions. So we need to try to take actions that counter the sense of impunity and say there will be consequences for you. We can't necessarily bring everyone to justice in the fullest sense, right? There's limits to what we can do across international borders. But what we can say is that if you're involved in gross violations of human rights, invasion, torture, genocide, then you are not welcome in our country, and your money is not welcome in our country. And if enough of us come together and send that message to violators of human rights, then there start to be more serious consequences. The end goal is that we tear away this impunity, so that people involved in regimes around the world will think twice, because they'll say, if I do this, then I won't be able to send my kids to that Western school. I won't be able to have an escape hatch if things go wrong for me in my home country. These are key mechanisms for ending a sense of impunity and promoting justice.
And the other big situation there is, the bigger picture is that once the opposition parties are able to put this forward to the government, essentially when the government takes action on something like this, then it would prompt maybe the United States or the UK or other countries to take notice and say, hey, perhaps we should also put sanctions against these individuals for violations of human rights. And
it's worth noting, in the U.S. they have a Magnitsky Act, and they already have the equivalent, a congressional trigger. They have a mechanism where a nomination for someone for a sanction can come from, we usually think of nominations as being a positive. This is of course negative, right? It's nominating someone to be sanctioned, but a nomination can come from Congress, and then the American administration has to respond. So a similar model, that we would have a nomination coming from Parliament and that the government would have to respond. And you're right, as much as possible, we want to be coordinating with our allies, because if somebody's told, hey, they can't come to the United States, but they can come to Canada instead, and there's some cases like that, right? There's an army general from Sri Lanka who was involved in the Tamil genocide, who's sanctioned in the U.S., not sanctioned in Canada, and so that person still has an escape. They still have somewhere they can come to, right? So if we're working with our allies, and this is really important.
Absolutely. I want to ask you about the race that's going on, the election race for the Conservative leadership, where there'll be a new leader come September 10th. Very exciting. And there's a lot of speculation that it might be a way for the Conservatives potentially in the 2025 election, if that's when it is. And by then, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau will be in place for about 10 years. And usually, that's when people want change in government. So it's a very significant election cycle. Any details you can share with us, and potentially if you're supporting any of the 6 candidates, who, and what's your take on what's happening right now?
We've got 6 candidates. The most exciting thing to me is not the leadership candidates themselves, but it's been the groundswell of response from Canadians. Estimates are, I think, and I don't have any inside information on the membership numbers, but I think there's been some reports of over 600,000 Canadians, and this is just blowing out of the water anything we've seen historically. The Liberal Party, they have what they call a supporter category, so you can vote in a Liberal leadership race for free. So there's no commitment, and anyone can show up and say they're a supporter and they can vote. And for us, you have to pay for the membership, right? It's $15 to get a membership. And yet, far more Canadians are preparing to participate in this leadership race than have participated in not only past Conservative leadership races, but past Liberal leadership races where it's been free to participate. So more Canadians are paying $15 to participate than paying nothing to participate in the Liberal leadership race. And that really shows that there is momentum behind change. And there's like, let's be frank, there's intense debate happening among leadership candidates. I don't think that's a bad thing. I mean, I don't think we should, we should, like these are serious issues facing the country. People are right to ask those serious questions. The main thing is going to be making sure the winner is able to gather up those 600,000 people that have come into the party and expand from there as we go forward. So I put out an endorsement. For me, I've said I'm putting Leslyn number 1 on my ballot. Pierre number 2 on my ballot. It's a preferential ballot, so people can rank them. But look, I've got, I know many of the leadership candidates. Many of them are good people, different visions, different ideas. I just really hope we can come together afterwards.
And what made you choose Leslyn Lewis as your front runner?
Well, I think it is valuable that she's a member of caucus. And she's got that experience in politics, but she's got a vast experience outside of politics prior to as well. She's got an impressive resume. She's done a great job articulating Conservative values and principles. I think she understands the Conservative coalition very well. The importance of freedom, as well as strong families and strong communities, putting those pieces together. And look, I think this is a region we've got to win in. Here in the Greater Toronto area, she's deeply connected in this part of the country as well. This is going to be a key battleground. And she is, I think, confident in Conservative convictions. Having a leader that stands for Conservative principles, that isn't afraid to articulate them, and believes that that's how we succeed as a party, is by being authentic and defending our Conservative principles, not trying to repackage ourselves as something else. To me, I think that's the road to success.
Well, absolutely, because I think as of late, with 3 election losses for the Conservatives, it was about the identity of the Conservative Party and how it's projecting itself to when it comes to voters in a general election. So now is the time. This will be this election's very significant, and I think Canadians know that it's really between the 2 parties, whether it's the Liberals or the Conservatives, that will form government. It's the leader of those 2 parties that will be Prime Minister of this country. So to be able to participate is an important factor.
Yeah, more than that. I mean, increasingly we're seeing the kind of coming together of the NDPs and the Liberals into and almost, formally they'll run separate candidates in that, but the NDP position is that Justin Trudeau is doing fine as Prime Minister, and that's why they're backing him up on everything, even on closure motions in the House of Commons. They're voting for Liberal closure motions. They're voting to shut down debate on bills along with the Liberals. They're They're backing their budget, their economic agenda. They even voted with the Liberals to not release to not access the Winnipeg Lab documents, which is a flip-flop from their previous position. So we see more and more the NDP just coming into the Liberal camp. So we've got two parties that are keeping Justin Trudeau as Prime Minister, and then we've got one party, the Conservatives, saying there should be an alternative.
Yeah, and as of late, I think the only time that I've seen Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the NDP, say anything against this government or ask questions has been about affordability. As of late, and his ideas, the NDP ideas on terms of how to address unaffordability. It's a crisis right now.
Yeah.
The Conservatives are talking about it and asking the government to do something about it. Can you share with us what are some of the Conservative ideas that have been proposed to the government to be able to address this unaffordability crisis when it comes to gas prices, housing, just day-to-day expenses to get by?
Yeah, great question. I know this is top of mind for so many people. And there's the affordability issue overall, and then there's certain specific pieces of it, like we talk about gas, we talk about housing. So affordability in general, we're seeing inflation, and a lot of that is just driven by the government is not putting in place policies to support economic growth at the same time as they're spending more and more money. Justin Trudeau has run up more debt in his time in office than every prime minister in Canadian history prior to, from 1867 until 2015. So it's just incredible and tragic, the volume of debt that's there, and look, that's being financed through printing of more money, and that's driving inflation, right? So in response to this, the finance minister is now saying we're going to spend a whole bunch more money to address affordability, which is, respectfully, it's like saying we have a flooding problem, so let's bring in more water, right? It's not the solution. Clearly, it's compounding the problem to just keep saying more and more government spending. We need the government to seriously consider policies that support economic growth and more controls on wasteful spending in government. And frankly, if we have more people working, there'll be less need for government spending. A lot of times when people are accessing government spending, it's because they're out of work, because they have certain needs that are not being met, or, as we saw during the pandemic, unfortunately, people's ability to work is being limited by government policies as well. So getting our economy moving again, harnessing the initiative that Canadians have, and I think that's so important. The Liberal NDP approach of more government control, more government spending, it just isn't working. But let's talk specifics about a couple of those sub-points, right? So gas prices. Liberal and NDP politicians want higher gas prices. That's why we have a carbon tax. What is a carbon tax? It is designed to raise gas prices because they think that'll make people drive less. So now they're saying, maybe gas prices are too high, but they're actually not willing to reverse the carbon tax policy. What we've said is, if you think gas prices are too high, let's remove the carbon tax, which is a policy designed to increase the gas price. And they're not willing to do that. We've put forward proposals concretely around that. They haven't listened. And then on housing, a lot of people are talking about housing right now. But the issue that we have with housing, so much of it comes down to housing supply, right? We need more housing available to people, and so it's hard to make housing more affordable without addressing the supply problem, and this is sort of just a different way of thinking, maybe, right? Like the Liberals and the NDP, they want to. They don't want to think of it in terms of what I would describe as real economic logic, that there's supply and demand, and we need to increase housing supply, and that's going to make more homes available to more people. And there's no magic bullet here, but removing some of those impediments that have held us back from providing that supply is really critical.
Yeah, and inflation at all-time high in 31 years, and Bank of Canada saying that it will increase again, like more towards the end of the year and potentially next year before we can go down to that 2% mark, which has made groceries very expensive and just day-to-day living. And now it's a crisis as people are trying to just make ends meet and put food on the table and pay their rent or pay their mortgage. And so now we're expecting, what are some of the ideas that we're expecting this government to react on? Because essentially when it comes to provincial level, people are looking onto their provincial government to say, what are we going to do about unaffordability? But really, on a federal level, that's where the agenda is driven.
Yeah, I mean, look, what I expect to see from the government, unfortunately, is more of the same. It's a it's kind of a doubling down on an existing economic philosophy that isn't working. They're saying, well, we just need even more government spending. We need, and so they're saying, okay, well, we're gonna provide these additional subsidies, likely, as we can expect, right? And they're not maybe understanding the fact that look, we're not going to get out of these challenges until we support economic growth, right? Things like expanding housing supply, things like supporting our energy sector.
You come from Alberta.
Yeah, removing the barriers that are in place, right? So I guess the conservative economic philosophy is to say people have the ingenuity to make our country prosper economically, to kind of return to the standard of prosperity and growth that Canadians have been accustomed to for so much of our history. That comes from the initiative and the ingenuity of Canadians. It doesn't come from government. It comes from Canadians that are working and struggling and innovating to move us forward. But where we fall down is when the government puts in place too many barriers here. Right, when the government is holding back new housing development, when the government is in fact artificially inflating the price of gas through higher taxes. Sometimes government isn't the solution, government is the problem. But then the solution is government getting out of the way and being engaged in a targeted and strategic way to help the most vulnerable. Obviously, if we start thinking about government in a different way as not always being the solution, more spending, more government involvement, but sometimes as the barrier and getting government out of the way. That's what's going to really propel our economy forward. And the case I'd make to folks is that if you look at just where we've been economically over the last 7 years, it isn't working. So at some point, it's time to stop doubling down on a failed strategy and go back to what made our economy so successful, especially during the Harper years and previous to that. The economic approach of this Liberal government is very different from the economic approach of previous Liberal governments under Chrétien and Martin. So I think we need to go back to that sort of time-honored Canadian wisdom that used to be actually more of a partisan consensus through the 90s and early 2000s, saying we need balanced budgets, we need to create space for the private sector, and we can't be running up this debt all the time.
Yeah, as economists are predicting that there might be a recession that is coming around for next year. And the last time there was a recession, it was during Stephen Harper's time, right, in 2008. Yeah. And Canada did far better than other countries, and especially our neighbor to the south, the United States and the UK. So this is very alarming time.
I mean, we went through the global recession. I think in the first year we ran a $30 billion deficit, and at the time that was just massive, right? And a lot of conservatives were wondering. But I think Prime Minister Harper showed a lot of wisdom in saying we need timely, targeted, and temporary stimulus for our economy and get back to balance. And in aggregate, the debt to GDP ratio went down under Stephen Harper. We were able to get back to balance by 2015. And then we come into COVID, and we're talking not tens of billions, but hundreds of billions of dollars of deficit. We were actually running tens of billions of dollars in deficit even prior to the start of COVID. The start of COVID. So yeah, just totally different scale in terms of numbers. The size of the deficit in the first year of COVID was more than the entire government spending in 2015. That's how much out of whack we've been in. And Liberals talk about not wanting austerity, not government needing to be there for people. I think, by and large, prior to 2015, the government was there for people. We still had public health care. We still had social services there. We still had various support, settlement services, and other things that are required. And yet the scale of spending has gone up so much. Something has got to give. We can't just keep spending at these levels.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights on all these factors that I know that are top of mind. Any final words for our viewers when it comes to what's actually happening in Ottawa and how does it impact their lives? Yeah,
well, I mean, one issue that I care a lot about, and I think it does have practical resonance for people, and we haven't talked about it yet, is just the issue of the state of our democracy. Mm-hmm. And I really think we're seeing some democratic decline under the Liberals. It doesn't mean we've stopped being a democracy or we're going to stop being, but our democratic institutions are not as strong as they once were. We see the government using various programming motions to suspend the normal work of Parliament. We have members of Parliament barred from being in Parliament because of their personal vaccination status. We have a number of areas, the use of the Emergencies Act, a number of areas where, when I would have, at the beginning of my career, talked mostly about human rights as being an international problem, there are questions about just the state of our democracy and human rights protections here in Canada. And a lot of the promises that Justin Trudeau made coming in 2015, he's actually gone the opposite direction. So I think as we think about these issues of addressing affordability and accountability, it's also tied to saying, is our Parliament as strong as it could be? Because if our Parliament was stronger, if our MPs weren't being limited in the work they can do by these kind of draconian measures the government is taking, then we would be able to, I think, hold back some of these kinds of measures. So I'd encourage people to jump in and be engaged with our democracy. Obviously, in our Conservative leadership race, it's great to see there is excitement out there. People want to get involved. There is a kind of political awakening that's happening right now in Canada. And affordability issues, democracy issues, human rights issues, I think they're all part of the package we need to be talking about. And I'm excited about restrictions being off now by and large, and being able to spend more time here in the GTA and connecting with people and talking about these issues ahead of 2025 or sooner. We might have an election sooner than that, and we'll be ready whenever it comes.
Well, that sounds exciting. Well, join us again and share your insights as you do come to GTA and deal with a lot of different organizations and community leaders. We'll be really excited to have you back here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us. This was a Y Media exclusive interview with Garnett Genuis. He is a Conservative MP, and he's joined us today to talk about the state of affairs in Canada, and more specifically what's happening in Ottawa. I'm Rona Singh. Until next time, take care and be well.
You are watching Channel Y. Channel Y, a South Asian Canadian channel.